Hello, everybody. Today's program will start at 11, and we will have Dr. Şenal Bilali, who will give his opening remarks. And then we will have a presentation on the nature of education, culture, and structuring. Professor Dr. Selahattin will chair the panel, and we will have the Minister of National Education, Ömer DİNÇER, former Minister of National Education, and we will have Professor Dr. Servet ÖZDEMİR. And this session, following this session, between 12 and 12:50, we will have the third panel on the autonomy of schools, conceptual, legal, and political perspectives, moderated by Professor Dr. Soner Polat and participated by Professor Dr. Mehmet Oktay Taftalı, Egemen FALCIOÐLU, and from Ankara Yıldırım Beyazıt University, Professor Dr. Zafer Çelik. After that, we will have a 1 hour break. And between 2 and 3:50, we will have oral presentations. And in those, we will have Aysel Gökçe, Hayriye Olgun, followed by Süleyman Sönmez and Ibrahim Limon and Bahriye Aydın. And finally, Gülenay Nagihan Kılıç, İlhan Demir Arıcı, and İlham Demir Kocabaş will deliver their presentations. And Erol Demir, Esra Yılmaz, and Mahmut Bektaş, two presentations back to back. And finally, Derya Can Kandil and Güldüz Gebeş will deliver their own presentations. And in the final oral presentations, we will have three back-to-back presentations. In workshop 4, we will have Mustafa Canıtes. In workshop 5, Nurullah Demir and Sevgi Gök will chair the workshop. And in workshop 6, Gizem Çakal and Ibrahim Çakal will be moderating the workshop. After that, between 4 and 4:50, we continue our program with our invited speakers. We will have Dr. Meng Tian from the United Kingdom, Professor Dr. Nick Pace from the United States, and Dr. Teofil Muayyimana and Dr. Denise Shers from the United States once again. From 5 and 5:50, we will have Professor Dr. Duncan Waits. We will have his opening presentation. And following that, between 8 and 8:50, we will have simultaneous oral presentations. In presentation 10, we will have Kevser Koç and Bakir Şahin, followed by Halime Nur Sezer, Halit Alper Eser, and Elmira İskenderova Baş will deliver their presentations. In oral presentation 11, we will have Celal Gülşen, Ayşegül Ünal Saraç, Hafize Bilgi and Rabia Kuruner, and Aslan Dikmen and Mustafa Elibol will deliver their own presentations. In oral presentation 12, we will have Nazmiye Hazar, Bilal Çankır and İbrahim Hakan Karataş, and finally we will have İsmail Tombuloğlu will deliver their presentations. We will then have another 1 hour break between 7 and 7:50, and the final session of today begins at 8, a workshop on further research about school autonomy. We are awaiting your participation and thank you for your attention. And now to deliver his opening remarks, I leave the microphone to Dr. Bilal Şener. Thank you. Thank you, Özlem. I'm now participating from North Macedonia, and we are delighted to be participating in this conference as the International Balkan University. And I believe that this is a great program, both in terms of content and in terms of the participants and it will contribute a great deal to the discourse. And I believe that this is a great initiative. And in terms of digitalization, the pandemic crisis and the 2023 vision, as an instructor working in these fields, I can safely say that in the 21st century, we are not revolutionizing, but evolving. So we are going through an evolution, a social evolution. We have to come to terms with the changes brought about by the digital transformation, and it has been difficult in the field of education, but it is going along nonetheless. So this is a process of evolution, and it is inevitable. And in terms of this digital transformation, everything we do, if we were to take a look at the outcomes, they are almost always positive. Of course, online classes have been tiring on our teachers and our instructors, but the next generation of students have found it easy to adapt to. And we've had very informative and interesting presentations in the past day, and I hope that we will be able to listen to more we will be able to listen to more interesting presentations, and hopefully we will hold another such conference in Balkan University as well. I extend you my sincerest greetings and wish you a very happy conference.
Selahattin Hocam, sözü size bırakıyoruz.
Now we give the floor to you, Professor Selahattin, and I would also like to offer my thanks to Şener Bilali,
Akif'in hem Yahya Kemal'in sesinden,
where you're addressing us from is a place that is of utmost importance for us. Thank you, Ibrahim. And I would like to welcome everybody.
Eğitimin kültürü ve yapılandırması
Now, the panel we have right now is on the nature of education and the structure of education and autonomy in education. And our participants have a great deal of experience, both in practice and in theory. They're all experts who are well-versed in their fields, in the bureaucracy, and they have contributed a great deal to our academic lives. They are all people of science. And we will be talking about a topic that is highly important and highly critical. And it is a topic that needs to be discussed and that has a conceptual, legal, and political background. And in that regard, since we are pressed for time, we will give each participant 15 minutes to deliver their presentations. And first of all, I would like to offer my respect to both our former ministers of national education and our presenters. And I would like to start off the session with Professor Dr. Ömer DİNÇER. Thank you, distinguished chair. And before I would begin my speech, I would like to offer my thanks to Istanbul Medeniyet University for organizing this conference, and the faculty members and all of the people involved in the organization of this conference, as well as the participants. I offer you my greetings and thanks. And I would also like to thank you for the invitation. Please remind me when I'm about to run out of time. I would really appreciate that, and I will do my best to not go over the time limit and deliver my presentation in due time. Distinguished friends and colleagues, Today, I'm going to be talking about the topic of school autonomy, but there is one thing that I would like to emphasize. Rather than the concept of school autonomy, I will be talking about the autonomy in the management of schools, the administration of schools. I believe that there is a crucial difference between these two concepts. One is more technical, but the other covers a field that is more expensive. And as we discuss that, we will also touch upon whether such a concept is feasible in Turkey or not. So, without further ado, I will now begin. And although I'm aware that you are much more well-informed on this topic than I am, but I will begin my presentation by defining what autonomy and what autonomy in schools regardless. Now, I divide this in two categories and four different factors. The administrative aspect of it in a national framework includes policies and strategies. It's influenced by these things. And it includes the right of schools to determine their own goals and strategies. And the second thing is, in the Turkish education system, although the resources are not found or created by these local school administrations, it includes the ability to spend those resources at their own disposal and the ability to choose their own teachers by their own criteria for success. And the third one is the ability to determine certain factors and altering the curriculum and considering everything from a perspective of these four factors. We will now examine whether achieving autonomy in schools is possible. Now, this paradigm of public administration and the management administration paradigm of our school system has five distinct features. One of this, it might be called public administration or the education system. They are synonymous in this context. It is the ideological feature of the education system. Public administration has an ideological nature. And the second thing is very interrelated with this ideology, and it is authority. And another thing that is interrelated with both these things is centralization. So, being authoritarian, being ideological, and being centralized make up the core of this management paradigm. And a closed-off bureaucracy. And what this means, I will go into more detail later, but the next thing is the fact that students and teachers have responsibilities, but their rights and their freedoms are often overlooked. Now, when you take into consideration all of these things, you can see the reflection of these four things on our system of education. And I will be very clear. During my time as the minister, I endeavored to make our education system more flexible and more democratic. And I received a huge pushback from both the secular part of the country and the more conservative part. I had three goals in mind. One of them was to have to provide our children with a degree of expertise, experience, and knowledge at a national level. And to provide our children with moral values that would benefit the whole community. And I believe that the rest should have been left to the parents. Giving the education system any sort of ideology would be not optimal. That's what I thought. But the way it is now, the ideology is highly salient in our education system. And although this is something that occurs independent of the teachers and the students, in order to enforce this ideology, you have to have a highly centralized structure where everything is decided by one central authority. So in order to have this happen, you need to have a field of practice as such. You first determine how you will be practicing your ideology. So in a certain course, in a certain week, this authority checks whether that the ideology has been covered. And the teachers do cover that ideology because there is a uniform curriculum in all parts of the country. And then you send the ideology, and then you determine whether that ideology has been covered in class by the teacher. If not, then you investigate the teacher. So there's three factors: ideology, authority, and centralism are salient once again in the education and in our education system. And education fails to reach or fails to become sensitive to the needs and the opinions of the people, of the students, and of the teachers. You might know that a closed-off system is not responsive to the needs or the opinions of the rest of the people, rest of the community. And it's important to open up this system to the rest of the people, rest of the stakeholders of this whole process. And both the teachers and the students have a responsibility. The students have to regurgitate the information fed to them by their teachers in examinations or tests. But in order to have true administrative autonomy, you need to go beyond all of that. And we need to prepare our children for actual life. And you need to have democracy, not authoritarianism, because they have their own local conditions, and you need to provide them with opportunities to adapt to those conditions. But a centralized structure is not conducive to that. So you need to have a decentralized structure instead. And this system needs to be open so that it needs to turn into an organic system so that the student community and the teachers can participate, and this system can respond to their needs and expectations. And to achieve that, you need to have the inputs and responsibilities, as well as the rights and freedoms of the people, teachers, students. You need to take into consideration in your system all of these things. But at the moment, the culture of management, culture of administration we have right now, we need to have certain competences. But this is very difficult to achieve in our current education system in Turkey. To be frank, this is something that needs its own session, its own conference even. Because making our education system democratic, turning it into an organic structure that provides students and teachers with opportunities This is what we must do. And as we say this, in an administrative framework, we see a similar scene in academy, because a curriculum-based education system, there is no place for students or the teachers. In the Turkish education system, the curriculum is so heavy that from colleges to the primary schools, almost all aspects have a certain degree of intervention by the public administration. Even the theology faculties or training faculties, even these faculties were not allowed to determine their own curriculums during my time as minister. And the centralized authority would go into great detail in determining what these institutions would teach and what they wouldn't. And I tried my best to reverse this situation. And I took my own initiatives. I held my own meetings with the Council of Higher Education, and I tried to have a free and competitive system of education. And I warned the Council of Higher Education that if we didn't have such a system, the consequences would be dire. And we needed to get the approval of the Board of Education. And you might also remember this authoritarian mindset and this centralized attitudes and such practices. We tried our best to end these practices. For example, abolishing the national security course, which I believe was a reflection of this authoritarian mindset, or abolishing mandatory school uniforms, or having centralized national holiday schedules, moving away from that and having students determine their own schedules, or having Kurdish lessons in schools, or having local electives and bringing flexibility into the curriculum. These are some of the things that I tried my best to achieve, but taking all of that into consideration, it is plain and clear that these are not changes that are easily achievable. Of course, there is a lot to talk about in this regard, but I won't be able to go into detail in all of these matters, but they are all problematic for us and for education. But all of these centralized, authoritarian, and ideologic factors in our education system, how does these affect our success in terms of the success of our education system? The results are surprising. The first example has to do with leadership. The individual efforts of school principals or school administrations. For example, different schools in the same district, in the same neighborhood. One is very successful, the other isn't. And the thing that determines this, although they have the same conditions, one principal is very dedicated and makes a lot of sacrifices, and that determines the success. So I have to emphasize that leadership is crucial in the success of a school. You're running out of time. Now, in school administration, if the principal of the school is able to create a culture that is open and democratic, and if he or she provides ample opportunities to teachers, and if he makes sure that every component of the school is able to participate in the decision-making process, then they end up being successful. And I believe that moving away from an authoritarian structure is the first step in discussing school autonomy in the future. And with that said, I offer my sincere respects to all participants. Thank you, distinguished former minister. It has been very informative in terms of both our problems in the field and theoretical problems. And thank you for your speech. Of course, one of the most prevalent problems of these curriculum-based systems is the problem of teacher autonomy. If we don't have teacher autonomy, then teachers have their capacity of being able to teach things to their students reduced. And this is something that we need to discuss definitely. So thank you. This has been very enlightening in terms of the need to restructure our education system. And thank you for reminding us that we need to discuss these problems and these situations more intensely. Now, we will now give the floor to Professor Dr. Samet Özdemir. Thank you. And I would like to thank all of our participants for giving me the opportunity to deliver my own presentation. Now, as I begin my presentation, I was considering whether we are overestimating the situation or whether we're drawing a picture that's too bleak, or I thought there are conferences where the autonomy of schools is being discussed, but what's happening here is not mere discussion, not changing the structure of it, but adding autonomy to it, adding autonomy to our system. Individuality here is lacking at the moment because individuality is an outcome of autonomy. And without those things, you cannot possibly lead your society. And our former Minister of Education, he has made great efforts in passing helpful laws, and I greatly appreciate his efforts in doing what he could, but we need to consider how our schools are being managed, what kinds of pressures our schools are under, and in what ways our schools need to be transformed, changed. And it's clear that we have certain differences with the West. They believe in evolution and we believe in revolution. We want to destroy the existing systems and build new systems from the scratch. But I believe that this isn't the right approach. And the second thing, I believe that ideology is the most prevalent problem. We cannot take ideology out of the education. This is something that we must do, but as of now, we can't. We first need to reach a consensus on what kind of people that we want to create. We want to create a kind of person, a kind of citizen that's able to think freely and critically. But with the current system, we fail to develop their creativities, we fail to endow them with the ability to think critically, to think for themselves. And this is our failure. Now, a story by Cengiz Aytmatov. And in that story, I won't go into much detail, but the main point of that story is that we need to make peace with our environments. And when we discuss school autonomy today, we need to ensure the participation of all components, the teachers, the students, and interventions that are done without the consent or participation of these components are doomed to fail. And interventions, a bureaucratic system, a bureaucratic approach that doesn't feed from innovation, from creativity, constitutes the basis of our problem that we have in our schools today. And I believe that we need to have a clear action plan that we all agree on. And we need to take off our ideology caps and think of our children. We need to have children that are able to think clearly, and we shouldn't be afraid of our own children. That's absolutely ridiculous. We need to open the way for them, and only then we can participate in the global stage. Because societies that don't think, societies that are not happy, societies and individuals that don't question, that don't see similarities and differences between things, that's not the way to be. So my advice to all participants and the organizers of this conference is that you should have the next conference perhaps on not autonomy, but interrelatedness, because I believe that these aren't concepts that are native to our own regions. I've had my own share of working in administration in my career, and I've had meetings with my colleagues. And the following day, the regulation that was passed was the opposite of what we discussed in the meeting. And I took this to the social media and I said, if you're not going to listen to our advice, then don't waste our time either. If you're going to do what you're going to do anyway, then do it and don't ask for advice from anybody else. So people see that ideologies are things that take over schools. But that's not what schools are. Schools are places of education where people learn to think. But when you introduce an ideology into a school, you disrupt the balance of the system. You disrupt it completely. But now we have an uncontrolled growth that has no foundation, no basis. You open a great many schools, but what kind of people do these schools train? You have IT, you have technologies, you have schools that teach languages, but that's not right. That's not the correct approach, because these schools don't question the problems. These schools don't question our reality. Instead, they ignore our problems. They ignore the situation that we have right now. And that's not how you create critical thinkers. That's not how you create individuals who can think for themselves. And in a situation like that, you can't possibly talk about justice. You can't possibly talk about equality. And we need to reach a brand new consensus, and we need to form a new social contract. And we need to take this discussion away from discussions of ideology, and we need to make sure that the voices of our children are being heard and respected, and they have freedom. Right now, we have a situation where even the electives are decided by a central authority. The children aren't even allowed to choose what elective courses they would like to take. And this is something that I heard from someone who had been working in the Ministry of Education. they said to me, "You're doing everything for nothing, so just you're better off not doing it at all." And this is what having ideology in your education system gets you. And I had an article about that, followed by a few of my colleagues. And once I finished my article and read it, I asked myself, should I have not written this article at all? What solution am I solving right now? Or am I solving any solution, any problems? But I believe that we need to keep our promise to society. And I believe that every aspect of our society needs to criticize the situation we are in right now. For example, you establish a technical university, and many of their presidents have graduated from faculties of theology, completely unrelated to their own fields. Or you create a faculty of education, but you don't have any professionals working in that institution that come from that field. So what do you hope to gain by this? Are you hoping to avoid criticism by those professionals, or are you avoiding accountability, or do you even have accountability? Do you know what you're responsible for, or what you're accountable, what you will be held accountable for? What we need to change is this approach exactly. School administrators are appointed by their own unions to some extent. This is something that everybody knows, but nobody talks about. For example, you open up, you found a project schools, but none of the personnel, none of the administrative team in that school have any experience in creating or conducting projects. So we need to change our approach, change our perspective, and carry Turkey into the 21st century and have an approach that respects the will of the students and receive their consent and their participation. Without that, you are doomed to fail. And once again, I reiterate, we need a new social contract. But we can't say that radical political Islam has much compassion or mercy for anything that requires these things. And we need to have a structure that has the students at its center. And that is my opinion on this topic. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Servet. And you finished 2 minutes early, so thanks for that also. You've talked about something that's highly important, and your speech has been complementary to the presentation of our distinguished former Minister of Education. But you've touched on something that's very important in that the Turkish education system is in a very dire situation right now, and we need to restructure it. And I believe that all of these things form the basis of the discussion. And you've also said that simply providing autonomy in the classroom is not enough. And I have one reminder to make. In Western systems, this is something that's often discussed. The duty of schools is to make sure that the children trust their own country. And this, I believe, is that something we're lagging behind, as well as training, creating individuals that are free, that are independent. And what we need to have is independent school principals, independent teachers. But of course, this is a discussion for another time. But now I would like to give the floor to another highly experienced individuals who have been working quite closely with the Ministry of Education.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I extend my greetings to all of the participants today. Today, we will be talking about the school autonomy within the context of the epidemic. If you'll remember, we actually covered this topic yesterday, and the director of the Provincial Directorate for National Education spoke about this. Burhanettin Dönmez also spoke, and you probably took your own notes as well. So let us continue from that topic. Now, schools are divided into three based on their level. It's elementary, middle, and high school. Of course, there's also the preschool level, but not everyone is able to attend. And schools also are distinguished based on other qualities. They can be good schools or bad schools or average schools. Our ministries actually divide them as A type, B type, and C type schools. Today, let's speak of these. And of course, after high school, there's another school, and we call that higher education as well. And those are the autonomous schools. That is the definition. They make their own decisions. Now, schools are very important organizations. In fact, from time to time, older citizens ascribe a more holy aspect to these as well. If you'll remember, we had two prime ministers. They had said that they would not allow anyone to slander schools or campuses or any religious sites. But it's important to know that if you ascribe a holy quality to an institution, then you will also have the power to also inspect and audit those institutions as well. Now let's go back to today's main theme. Today, I would like to speak of the following. If you'll remember, in this year was declared the year of Yunus Emre. I'm not sure if you've ever read his works, but I would like to speak of his words. He said, the speaker is reading a poem from Yunus Emre that with the theme of calling out to the hearts of people. Now, when you hear something, you cannot accept it right away. I did not come here just for a cause. My cause is just love and reaching out and calling out to the hearts. This is what Yunus Emre says. And I say that this world will be left to our children and to our youth. I did not come to convey my experience today. I came to convey and share my thoughts. If we believe in something, then I believe that we have to contemplate on these thoughts in order to develop our thoughts. For this reason, today you listened to our former Minister of Education today. And I also thought this was a very beneficial talk. What did he say? He said we have to go beyond the borders, think outside the box. If you're thinking about something and you're restricting it, then you're not able to comprehensively reflect on it. My colleague Servet also spoke today, and he said two main things. He said that the philosophy, we have to agree upon the philosophy of this, and we have to first train individuals as a priority. Now, this was a bit of an introduction. I know you all miss schools. I know so many teachers are saying, oh, if only schools would open, if only we could begin at school and start teaching in classrooms so that we could address our students within the classroom. Now, I don't exactly agree. I have different thoughts, and if we actually all agreed, there would be no point in gathering here today. And why would 127 people be listening if we didn't have something different to say? Now, to begin with, the school, students, teachers, exams, education, learning, classrooms, all of these concepts, independent of all of these concepts, if you're thinking of something new, then you have to create new concepts, new terminology. These old terms cannot be used to think of a new concept. I don't think it's possible. Now let's put these all aside. In fact, there's babies, child, teenagers, adults. Let's put these on another end. If we could think of a new term, and let's start there. Servet also pointed to this. If we can just say humankind and focus our discussion on that, it would be great. So what is humankind? What are we talking about? If you ask me, humankind is the last component that has been added to nature. So there is a cross discourse, I believe, on this. Human beings are a part of nature. They're not the best of all creatures. We are humankind. And I think it's beneficial to start here, just like flowers and butterflies and clouds, we're all a part of nature. Now, Selahattin had actually given me assignment before. He spoke of humankind as the best of all creatures, but then he said, I do not think like that anymore. We're actually a part of nature. So there, especially in the conservative society, many people question why humans are actually on this earth. Well, why were humans created? Someone else usually answers on their behalf. Human beings came to this planet for 4 years. One is to live, second, to develop, third, to succeed, and fourth, to be happy. And this fourth point is actually encompasses production, reproduction. So living actually starts from respecting all beings, ensuring people to live happily. This is important. And this is the responsibility of the government, of administrators. Of course, we speak of this often. If people can live, then governments can live, is what they usually say. But this phrase was taken from a novel. It is attributed to a novel. So respecting humankind lays at the foundation of enabling them to live. When people are born, they are born upon their nature. And for a very long time, many people have said that humankind is born upon the nature of Islam. And I've spoken with theologists, I've spoken with people in Ankara, but no, the actual saying is humankind is born upon its inherent nature. The inherent nature of human beings comes together with their genes, and it interacts with their surroundings, and by doing so, human beings are able to develop. And we call this learning. If human beings cannot learn, then they cannot live. So they first need to be able to live, and in order to do so, they need to learn. So what will they do? What will they wear? How will they change? They need to learn, and we need a suitable environment in order for this to take place. Now we're clarifying the picture here a bit. Human beings actually are here they need to learn in order to live. And in order to learn, we need suitable and appropriate environments. So our attention needs to be on ensuring that environments promote learning. Now, I think that in learning environments, I rank them as follows. In the first environment, it needs to be safe and natural. It is the mother's womb. This is where people learn many things. It is physical and mental development. All of it starts in the mother's womb. And for this reason, educators, the government, rulers, the people, eventually, all of them need to respect pregnant women. And a healthy pregnancy will result in fruitful results and learning within the first environment. The second environment is family. Families actually play a very crucial role in the development of children. It is not only very crucial, but it is also unparalleled, and they have the very sensitive period in this regard until the age of 6. The third environment is society, and within that society there are institutions. What are those institutions? They are the municipalities, the muhtars, the government, and also the schools. Now, when we say school, we say it's an environment within society. What is school? School is not something to be overemphasized. School is actually an institution for a certain age group. It has a certain curriculum, and it is shaped according to that. For those who are enrolled, they are expected to develop, but it is an artificial environment. Schools are artificial environments and they are bureaucratic. Now, if you'll allow me, I would also like to talk about an exam that took place 70 years ago. It is the exam that corresponds to the university entrance exam at the time. In the Turkish part of the exam, there was a question and it asked, opening one school, is it equivalent to closing one prison? I was very excited. I wrote pages and pages to answer this question, and actually I succeeded in the exam. And if you were to ask me today to write about this topic, I would hesitate. I would first stop to think, especially considering Nail Yıldırım and his teammates. They say that there are books for letters from the prison. And after I read that, my pen is actually very hesitant. I'm very hesitant in my writing. So I don't really believe in this anymore. And in the past 5 years in Turkey, there are 300 plus prisons. In 2020, this increased to 355. And the schools went from 45,000 to 55,000. The schools are increasing and the prisons are increasing. And with these slogans, you cannot actually improve schools. So if you ask me what we should do, I would advise this. I will try to be very brief and concise. In the mother's womb, we talked about protecting that natural environment. And as a continuation of that, there is the family. And we need to ensure that the family is the preliminary step and that they are organized and that they're equipped with the necessary qualities. Teachers and administrators always criticize. They say that parents do not come to school. Why should they come to school? They don't have a mutual language to share. Parents don't know what curriculums are, what assessments are, who the teacher is, who the principal is, what talent is, what is genius, they're not familiar with these. In the first early periods of the Republic, we let go of social development and we are lagging behind. So we as educators, as regulators of education, we need to focus our attention on families, on the education of families. But I pause here because what you've said, I've listened to my colleagues, I've listened to the distinguished minister. And we do not want a family education based on ideology. We want to focus on scientific findings. What are children? What is learning? What does it mean to raise children? We need to think of these on a skill level, and that is the family education we need to focus on. Now, and since society needs to take responsibility for children, today's children, I apologize for saying this, but Servet also, they're not like the children of your time, Servet. I'm not sure if you guys were incredible, but you did whatever we asked. Now, children are very fast. They're very, very fast. And we're trying to slow them down. No, we should not do that. We should not try to slow them down. And we won't be able to accomplish this anyway. Now with respect to school autonomy, we're actually running low on time. How much time do we have left? I'm sorry, you're out of time. All right, let me wrap up then. The Ministry of National Education has regulations regarding the expectations of the children, and let's think about how much we've been able to accomplish these. There used to be a part and report cards talking about development of children, but we see that it does not look too optimistic. So when we say school autonomy, we think of enabling children to learn better. Thank you so much. I apologize if I've exceeded my time. We have about 3 minutes remaining. Instead of making an assessment, I would like to listen to Ömer, DİNÇER, and Servet. I welcome them to provide their final remarks. Thank you so much. To be honest, I think that school administration, their autonomy, it lies upon two main foundations. One is leadership and the other is culture. So we need to be more democratic, more decentralized, more inclusive. And the leader, instead of adopting an authoritarian style, they need to adopt a more democratic style that respects the rights of individuals. We need to equip them with these qualities. And if we're not able to do so, then school autonomy and discussing such topics will only remain on a theoretical level. And what's more, both the speakers today spoke about, I think it was Servet, he spoke about the concept of change. He spoke about not revolution, but evolution. Those were the concepts that we focused on. I would like to say that in order for Turkey is forced to impose revolutionary change, but let me explain. When we think of authoritarian styles, they do not trust anyone but themselves. They perceive contradictory thoughts as a threat. So in the Western world, when there are environmental changes, they are able to adapt an evolutionary level, but in Turkey and countries that are ideological, there is not support, because there is an incredible gap between the environment, and we call this a strategic gap, actually. So either you will enter a crisis and fall apart, or there will be a revolutionary change and you will take large steps. Unfortunately, this is what Turkey is experiencing. And from an Ottoman perspective, you'll see that there is always resistance and there's always an attempt for change. Now, I believe that the education system, I'm aware that this is what's happening in our system. We'll see if our leaders will be able to achieve this. I extend my deepest gratitude and regards to you all. Thank you so much. Now, Servet Özdemir will offer the final remarks. Thank you so much. It was a very nice conference. I have taken my own notes and I've been able to test my own ideas. We need to continue learning. And I think that we need a new family, a new society. And in the 19th century school, it does not meet our needs. It does not meet our needs in this regard. So we need to rethink this concept. And for this reason, we need to focus on students. Also, just as our minister had said, I'm very familiar with these topics. We do not have an evolutionized school. From the 11th century onwards, we have not changed, but universities can do this actually. There are paradigms, and when you're out of hope, you have to deny the current practices. You need a new method, and there are actually complementary systems. So revolutionary change actually brings a hero together with it, a savior. And I believe in a wide-scale participation. I believe that will be more beneficial. School is a learning environment, and I believe that we need to redefine this concept. And that's why school is the most important in this regard. And in classes as well, I believe I still support and adopt this idea. I think schools are the most important, and they need a balance of authority, and they need to respect students. Student education needs to respect students. If I listed them all here, we would not have enough time, but we need to respect them all, and we need to understand that if your ideology can be, if you believe in yourself, then you do not need to be afraid. People who are hesitant cannot establish civilizations. They need to think differently. But what's clear is that we need a new school, a new understanding, and we need to share this with society. We need to share the truth. We need to tell them what situation we're in. And we need to we should not focus on just the problems. It's a new generation and a new school, and I think we can achieve this, but we need energy, people, and time. And of course, these concepts are an inherent, they need to be inherent part of schools, or else we cannot just say, oh, let's give schools autonomy. We actually need to take action in order to achieve this. I would like to thank all of the participants for joining us here today. Thank you so much, Servet. I think it was a very fruitful discussion. We laid the ground for future debates today. And of course, education is constantly evolving, and we need to continue to discuss and debate it. Who are we, and what should we teach our children in the future? This is discussed not only in Turkey, but also the world. And what are we teaching our children for the future? They need to be critical, cooperative, creative. They need to create synthesis, and all of these concepts need to be focused on. None of our children should be left out, and we need an independent education system. We need to continue these discussions. The nature of education and the structuring of education is all focused on our school autonomy topic today. Of course, I would like to thank Ömer DİNÇER, Aytaç, AÇIKALIN, and Servet ÖZDEMİR for joining us here today. I would like to thank you on behalf of the organizing committee. Thank you so much.
Değerli hocam, ben de size çok teşekkür ederim.
I would also like to extend my gratitude to the minister, to Aytaç AÇIKALIN and Servet ÖZDEMİR. Thank you so much for your invaluable insights, and thank you for sharing them with our participants here today. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity to shift our attention to the next session. And if there's anything else you'd like to add, please let us know. After this session, we will have Professor Mehmet Oktay Taftalı from Istanbul Medeniyet University. He will offer a talk, and this will be followed by Zafer ÇELİK. He will talk about the sociology of Turkey, and they will talk about Turkey's bureaucracy and its autonomy. And from Beykent University, we will have Egemen FALCIOİğlu. He will speak about autonomy as well. We will start that session in 3 minutes. But in Turkey, we've also hosted Duncan Wade, and at 5 o'clock, he will provide one of the keynote speeches. And also, he's a very humble individual. He's very aware of education across the world, and I invite all of our participants to join his talk at 5 p.m. And of course, we have other invited speakers. Before that, we will have other panels, other talks. And at 10 and 11 tomorrow, we will have 2 important panels. One is for special education and disadvantaged groups. And we will speak of autonomy in that context. And we have many professors who will speak during that panel as well. Mukadder Boynak, Filiz Meşeci will also speak about school autonomy in Turkey. Now, tomorrow in the afternoon, we will see that there will be a closing session and there will be a award ceremony for the best talks. And if any of you would like to contribute, Selahattin or any of you, Ömer DİNÇER, we would like to publish a final paper if there is anything that you would like to add to that. I think you can just choose from my talk. I think that would be best.
Bu arada bu vesileyle Sayın Bakanım ve diğer
And
konuşmacılar
also, I'd like to make a request. If we could transcribe your talks and we could publish this in a book, would you approve of this? After transcribing it, if you can send it to me for revisions, I would be happy. Also, if there's a video recording of this talk, I would also be happy if you could share it with me. We have recorded this talk and we will crop your speech and send it to you. Our technical team is working in the background, so it may take some time for it to reach you. No problem at all. Thank you so much. I wish you all luck. Thank you so much for your contributions. We have many different academics from more than 20 different countries. They shared very invaluable information, not only about the digital age, but also autonomy, From Kuwait to Canada, from China to Bolivia, we were able to listen to various dimensions, and we will continue to do so. We have people from Rwanda, Egypt, Lebanon, and your very invaluable contributions have been very helpful along the way. Thank you so much for your views.
Saygıyla selamlayarak diğer oturumu
I
başlatmak.
offer you my deepest respects and would like to now begin the next session. I will be moderating this next session, and we will be focusing on the political aspect of school autonomy in Turkey, and we will be following this last session where we examine school autonomy within the context of nature, and now we will have a conceptual, legal, and political perspective as we examine the school autonomy. And we will have Professor Dr. Sonet Polat, Professor Dr. Okay Taftalı, and Dr. Egemen FALCIOÐLU, and Professor Dr. Zafer Çelik. Now, Professor Dr. Oktay is also here among us. And now, first of all, I would like to thank all of our participants for being here today. Professor Oktay, Professor Zafer, Professor Egemen, and of course, first and foremost, we have philosophy followed by the sociology. And so first of all, we can start with your presentation from a theoretical framework, Professor Oktay. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. And I hope that you will have a successful conference. Now, when you talk about autonomy and experience, we are met with two opportunities. The first is administrative autonomy. So the autonomy of educational institutions and the autonomy of this administrative structures. And the second is the autonomy of the educators, of the education. Now, I'm going to go into the legal and administrative aspect. These are beyond the scope of my interest. I'm a teacher of philosophy, and I have been teaching philosophy for 12 years, and I have been a counselor in schools for 11 years prior to that. So out in the field, I am deeply interested in the autonomy. And this is the area where I'm an expert. Now, when we defined information in philosophy, is the relationship between the subject and the object, period. One sentence. And now this already implies autonomy. So the subject that knows and an object that is the object of the act of knowing by the subject. This is information. And information is part of education. And according to Plato, education is done by the educator. So in the pedagogy of Plato, education is an education of morality. How do you create moral citizens, moral individuals? That's the whole question. So social issues, issues of the community, both back then and now, and in all parts of the world, people deal with a phenomenon called the quality of individuals. And this quality is defined within the field of ethics. So creating virtuous individuals, virtuous citizens. This is the goal of education. Of course, it has many goals and many definitions and many answers to the question of what is the purpose of education. But this is the historical starting point of what education is, training virtuous citizens. Plato and his teacher Socrates, which I believe was the progenitor of education, the first teacher. His approach to education has to do with the relation between the teacher and the student, and this transference of experience, what we also consider as the relationship between the master and the student. And this is concurrent with the approach of the mindset of humanism. And in his work called Didaktika Magna, he puts forward a new concept, a new type of humanism called the frontal education, an education of the masses. So taking in the children as groups, and then you train them, you grade them, and you provide them with a standardized mass education where they have grades, where they have assessments and whatnot. But this is not a humanist education. I'm not discussing the content of it, but the structure. This is not conducive to autonomy. For example, I was a student in Haydarpaşa High School, and we had a classroom of 65 students and one teacher. And this teacher, they establish their authority and their integrity based on their information. But that was so impossible that they would resort to violence, because everybody back in my time had received a slap or two from their teachers, because that was the day of establishing authority. Of course, this isn't something that's discussed now, it's a problem of the past, but what I'm trying to tell is this matter of autonomy has to do with the teacher, has to do with the instructor, and this is something that they can create using the authority that they base on their expertise and information. Of course, this is an ideal situation, and such an education in our world today, where humanism is prevalent, is not possible in primary and secondary schools. Of course, in college, we are able to achieve this to some extent. For example, you have 2 PhD students, and you've been working with them for 5 years, for 4 years, for 7 years even. And during that time, the relationship between the teacher and the student has turned into companion, has turned into a sharing of a vast deal of experiences. And now, for example, I'm voicing some opinions, but they are not the opinions of Oktay Taftalı alone. They are the opinions of İsmail Tunalı, Macit Gökber, Nermi Uygur. So my instructors, my teachers are voicing their own opinions and beliefs through me. So this is the phenomenon of tradition, as we call it in philosophy. So the relationship between the teacher and the student, that is what needs to be given autonomy. So this frontal education, within the conditions of frontal education, mass education, you need to have the teacher and the student. For example, certain students, they have their own motives, they have their own talents, and they are distinguished by those talents. And in doing that, they may have a distinct relationship with their teachers. Of course, teachers can have their own feelings and emotions of sympathy and empathy. And although they need to move away from that, sometimes teachers may prefer students that are more willing, that are more hardworking. They are encouraged by these qualities, and this is only human. Again, with me as well, a person, a student that is hardworking, that asks more of me, motivates me ultimately. And I am more sympathetic towards their cause as a result. And these opportunities should not be provided randomly, but you need to embed it into your education program, into your system of education. And you need to consider how to achieve that. That should be our question. That should be our goal. For example, for certain students or for students under certain conditions, it's not possible to achieve this in a classroom of 40 students, but in perhaps extracurricular activities or quote unquote their free time or what could we define as their hobbies. But of course, free time is not free and hobbies are not hobbies. These aren't random instances. They're all belonging to a gestalt formation. So, for example, these exercise times where, or the time where they draw pictures or the time where they argue, all of these extracurricular activities have a supplementary role in our country. What we say is that, is it maths? Okay. Or is my child good at maths? Maybe not, but they might be very good at theater. So we need to customize education and customize our attention towards their own talents, towards their own disposition. And we need to create and formulate our education programs according to these things. So in classes, in different types of schools, and their own unique forms of autonomy and their autonomy with relation to the Board of Education, the administration, and whatnot. Of course, this is a different discussion altogether, and it's beyond my scope of expertise. But I would like to say, first and foremost, there isn't a thing called a student without talent. There is no such thing. But there are students with talents that lie in different areas, and it is our duty to discover those hidden talents. But at the moment, the way we are now, no teacher has the time or the inclination to discover those talents. They just hand out their instructors and go. And they don't go into whether a student is interested in arts, interested in sports, or if they're interested in sports, in what kind of sports, what are they good at? They don't know, and they don't have the opportunity to learn. They don't have the opportunity to know these things. Of course, I'm talking about back when I was a student, but if they were to have that opportunity, or if they had the support, maybe they have this opportunity, maybe they have this assistance in private schools where they were able to discover the talents or discover the inclinations, the unique dispositions of students. But this is only accessible by certain families that have certain means, certain financial resources. But this concept of autonomy, this concept of free thinking, critical thinking, these individuals that are virtuous, that are critical thinkers, in order to create such individuals, in order to train such individuals, the teachers, the education system, and the education institution need to develop projects and programs that have the goal of doing exactly that. And this needs to be deliberate. We shouldn't leave it to chance. We need to, for example, for 12 years, for 14 years, the state shouldn't leave their affairs to chance. They need to be deliberate in their endeavors. And when you put everybody in one room, you shouldn't condemn them all into one uniform curriculum. And this could be something that the Board of Education could discuss. For example, I call it the laziness pedagogy that deals in how to manage free time, for example, how the student spends their free time, how they can be reached by their educators, by the education system during their free times. This is something that focuses on this concept exactly. Could you perhaps wrap it up? We are running low on time. Okay, now I will finish shortly. Of course, this is a subject that begets a lot of discussion, but to sum it up, during mass education processes, both in terms of the cases and both in terms of opportunities, we have a job to do, and we need to focus on individual students, and we need to have individual teachers focus on these individual students to turn them into individual citizens that can think for themselves. And we need to create our programs, create our systems with this goal in mind. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Professor Oktay. And if there are any questions, we will be relaying them to you. And if not, you will have a brief 2 minutes to say your final words on this topic. Of course, I don't know if it would be correct to use the term sociology of education, but we now have Zafer Çelik to deliver their own presentation on this topic. Now, thank you, everybody. I will now focus on the question of whether autonomous schools are possible in Turkey. And now, of course, we've already talked about what autonomous schools are and what they aren't, but I will define it briefly. Autonomy is the freedom of schools in certain matters, making decisions locally, or an education approach that is more or less decentralized. Now, my answer to my question that I asked prior is this. Considering the situation in Turkey, I believe that there isn't much or any chance to have autonomous schools in Turkey. And this is impossible for both the students, and this is not desired by either the students or the principals or the teachers. And this is what I'm going to be focusing on. I would like to start off my presentation with a brief anecdote. It starts like this. The Council of Higher Education is very authoritative. They decide on everything. They leave no room for freedom, and universities should be more autonomous, is the discourse. But when the discourse moves into quality, people start saying, why doesn't the Council of Higher Education intervene with the PhD program or the thesis? So a discourse that starts with a criticism of autonomy then moves into a field that is highly centralized. And this has to do with the education in lower levels, education, primary, secondary, and high school education. So this goes for these types of education as well. And as a researcher, as someone who works in the field, over the past 25 years, in many national levels, state programs or projects, EU projects or the World Bank projects, in many of these projects, this is a concept that has been often emphasized. For example, the World Bank even has been emphasizing this decentralized education system over many years. And this is one of the fundamental components of every discussion since 2010. So school-based management, or despite all this demand for this concept, what we see is that the Turkish education system has become so centralized, as if Turkey is one of the most centralized education systems in the world. And this has been the case for the past 25 years. And I would like to give certain examples for that. For example, appointing the teachers, completely centralized. No human factor at all in this process. They have their own scores, and of course there are some exemptions, but the norm is very centralized, no human factor at all. Or course books. For example, we are talking about the geography, we are talking about the seasons, and the schedule is fully set. Everybody has the same course books, everybody has the same curriculum. There's no flexibility to be mentioned anywhere. And this has to do, for example, consider the student selection process. Consider the high school student selection process. Again, very centralized. For example, a brief example about the pandemic. We have shut down schools in areas where there are virtually 0 cases. Why? Why is that? It's a result of a centralized approach. So when you consider all of this, for example, what I would like to say is this. Of course, the Turkish education system is highly centralized, and there is a societal response to that centralized approach. And this is that. People want this, basically. And this is something that also restricts the freedom of schools. But the reason for that is that we have a low level of trust in each other and in the state. So we seek the minimization of the human factor, and we would like to have processes that are uniform, that are standardized. For example, consider school principles, one of the most fundamental principles that we have been discussing today. For the past 15 to 20 years, if you were to look at the regulations, whenever there's an interview, whenever there is something that goes beyond this objective processes, then the parties almost always resort to going to the court. So they always object. And when you go beyond the borders of Turkey, and when you say to them, we would like to appoint teachers simply based on their examination scores, they wouldn't even begin to grasp that concept. It would sound so foreign to them. We have so many fears in a situation where we wouldn't have autonomy, and this prevents us from achieving true autonomy, where local institutions make their own decisions. For example, let's have a unique daily practice. No one would consent to it. Theoretically, everybody is for such things, but in practice, nobody actually wants any autonomy in their decision-making. For example, consider the teachers. One of the most fundamental components of education is the teacher grades. Some are published, some aren't, but in most research, we see the following. A diploma grade and a teacher's grade is highly correlated. So what the grades we give have high validity, but whenever I say that these teachers' grades are very trustworthy, everybody objects. They give instances where the teachers aren't reliable, so they don't trust the teachers' grades. They are anxious about it. They are anxious about autonomy. So they seek guidance. So they seek having a predetermined schedule about the examinations, for example. They would like to know how many questions they should ask, what type of questions they should ask, and how the examinations should progress. If you might remember, several years ago, there was a discussion about open-ended university entrance exam questions, but the practice fell short of the discussion. But if you were to look at Europe, when you look at their own university entrance exam questions, they are wildly different. They ask students to write their own essays, and they are evaluated individually, both in Germany and in other countries in Europe. But if you were to say to a German instructor or to a German student what we've been doing in Turkey, they wouldn't be able to grasp. Of course, they all have their own unique systems, but it all comes back to this issue of trust, the trust that we lack in Turkey, in our Turkish education system. So this isn't related to the size of the population or the size of the student population, but this has to do with creating a field for teachers where they could be free. Now, I will move on to my other topic. And this will be discussed later, of course, but the second article of our Constitution on education, it says that education should be based on science. And it also says that no institution of education that are against these principles can be opened. But both the Human Rights Declaration or the Children's Rights, you have the following. You have this expression that opening private schools should be possible and it should be supported by the states. And in the West, you see this. You see a certain degree of diversity, but this diversity cannot be found in our own country because this diversity is prevented, it's hindered. So this matters of private schools, or this problem that restricts the freedom in all of our education institutions is the standardized exams that we apply across the country. Now, a brief example. For example, in the first grade, we say to teachers, don't give grades that are too low, or don't do very complex examinations. So even in the first grade, we begin to put the children into a very rigid system. And this takes away the autonomy of both private schools and public schools. And these centralized, standardized tests restrict the whole education system very greatly. So the responsibility falls not on the shoulders of private schools or public schools alone. For example, they teach literacy in preschools. They guarantee this and that. And this is inconceivable for me. And when I talk to a different school and when I talk to a different professional, I learned that there's a huge pressure on students in terms of preparing for these standardized exams. So finally, Turkey has certain features that prevents autonomous schools or autonomy in education, and people don't really want autonomy regardless. So we can talk about autonomy all we want, but the discourse will eventually shift towards the restrictions of the freedoms of teachers. That's what's going to happen eventually, regardless. So autonomy is a concept that's not feasible for Turkey at the moment.
Thank you so much. And Oktay also was a bit more optimistic, actually. Now let's see from a legal perspective what the current situation is. Yesterday we had foreign guests and they spoke of the EU and legal regulations. And we also had representatives from other countries that spoke about this obstacle. So conventional education is actually against autonomy. It's not compatible with it. All right, let's leave the mic to Egemen FALCIOİDLU. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Okay, to begin with, I'd like to thank all the institutions and Medeniyet University in particular for organizing this series of conferences. I'd also like to extend my deepest regard to the participants. Now, there are, of course, subunits of law, and law tries to encompass all of these. Since our topic is autonomy, we will focus on that. But this autonomy that we speak of in different areas, in different fields, there are different perceptions, but are there overlaps? Or even if they're not any overlaps, are they interrelated? So let's speak about that. I am a practitioner of law in Turkey, and I would like to talk about what the situation in Turkey is like. So if we speak of autonomy and constitutional law, what we mean is that it needs to be an institution. So in order for it to be so, it needs to have a legal entity. And of course, there's the government, there's municipalities, there's universities, and there are other directorates. They have public entities, they need to be autonomous, and they need to be managed locally. Now, of course, the government needs to preserve its unity, and it's not just this unity, but the public services need to be regulated appropriately. In order to do that, we need to have this in place. And that's why we have to find a way for this tutelage. So, of course, there are two forms. And when we look at Turkey and in other countries, we see that in federal governments as well, not everything is decentralized. In fact, there are also centralized approaches. And in all countries, decentralization and centralization actually go hand in hand. And so what happens with decentralization is the decisions are made from a center, and there's an attempt to implement these in other areas. Of course, there are pros and cons of both of these. So instead of criticizing them, I think that all countries need to effectively use both. And for this reason, in public services, and of course, national education and university education is a public service. So in the distinction between decentralization and centralization, we need to focus on these, especially in parliaments. But they do not decide on this in a very independent manner. They consider the history, the sociology of the country, and they decide accordingly. So in national education in our country, what is the system that we have for national education? In the current legislation, we see that there is elementary school and middle school, and then there's high school, and above that, we have higher education. So since elementary school and middle school are national education, there is an Article 42, and it is offered to all of the public, and it is designed by the Ministry of Education and implemented across the nation. Now, of course, there's a chain. Above, at the very top is the president. Below that is the Ministry of Education. There are provincial directorates for national education. There is the school, there's the administration, and then the teacher. So this is the current structure that is in place. How can we position these? Well, we have examples in Turkey that we can focus on. So for example, in our country, we have structures with relatively autonomous systems. Actually, there is a law and there are private institutions, and their objective, for example, if there are foreign companies in Turkey, and the children of diplomats also want to attend these during their temporary stay in Turkey. And so they do not stray from the curriculum of their original countries, they send them to these schools. But the main essence of all of these is not just they only accept the families of foreign nationals, and Turkish citizens cannot attend them. They determine their own curriculum and they determine their own foundations. But of course, this was approved by the Ministry of Education, and they're able to design their own curriculum. But the legal grounds say that these schools cannot go against the culture and ethics and unity of Turkey, and this is the main prerequisite. Beyond this framework, of course, the ministry has the right to inspect such schools, and beyond that, especially in the context of national education, it's not very easy to implement this because there are the citizens of foreign countries and their children actually need to be able to receive education, even if it's for a short period of time in Turkey. And that's why there are multiple institutions in Turkey, and we cannot implement them across all of them. Now, there are also universities. They are where knowledge is fostered. Of course, we speak of the autonomy of universities in Turkey, and it's an issue of debate with respect to the ranking internationally. Of course, we wish to improve, but when we compare it to other institutions such as elementary school, they're driven by knowledge, and of course there are educational organizations. The personnel are autonomous, their materials are autonomous, but these universities are public legal entities, and there are separate entities from the government. And for this reason, these universities, actually there are about 50,000 schools in Turkey. And in terms of organization, it is nearly impossible to give them all autonomy, because let's say there are 50,000 organizations and we formed organizations, but maybe there will only be 5,000 in such organizations. And so organizing them and regulating this is very difficult, but national education attempts to do this in all countries. Now, underlying all of this is the freedom to choose your own curriculum. But when this happens, there's also indecisiveness. And the public services, for example, need to be regulated, or else it will be inhibited, because if it is scattered, then they will not be able to achieve that. So when I'm talking about autonomy, I'm talking about a separate public legal entity. So overall, we see that in the area of education, the concept of autonomy can actually be perceived from different angles. It can be federalism, participatory democracy, and other various angles. So these different fields approach these differently, and some of them approach them from public spheres and other spheres, but specifically in pedagogy, we see that it can be perceived as such. is the delegation of authority, and the other is decentralization. These are actually legal concepts, and they are present in our current government structure. Now we need a separate legal entity needs to be established. The delegation of authority are actually within the framework of central government. Now there are, of course, negative sides as well. And in order to make it more active, the existing systems actually are attempting to solve this, and in order to, they're trying to more effectively implement this. Now, in this regard, we are within a hierarchy. National education has its own hierarchy, and the Ministry of National Education, provincial directorates as well, they are trying to balance the system together with the teachers as well, and they want the service to be provided most effectively. So, and within this hierarchy, can we find a solution? Yes, we can. We can form association instead of associations, and with respect to legal components, it's not easy, it's not possible to implement this. Even if we try to, we would have to change the constitution, but we're not even certain whether we will achieve our goals. There will be a lot of confusion, and within this regard, we have to find a solution within this hierarchy. And to do so, I think in today's conference, especially in the current panel and before, I think we're all attempting to achieve this, but within the hierarchy, there is the minister at the top and the teacher at the very bottom. There are, of course, steps between each level. But as we go further down the chain, we see that those are the implementers of the system. But the school principal also. But the people that directly provide this service are actually the teachers. And at the very top levels of the hierarchy, they may give commands to lower levels. And that's why we have to focus on the current administrative system, and we focus on it from different perspectives. So for example, if there's the hierarchy of the army or the military, it's very different, it's very rigid, and that's how it needs to be. If we consider judges as well, they work for the government, and we see that they are entirely independent, and each judge cannot command another judge. That's why we see a completely independent chain among them. But with respect to ministries, such as the health ministry, the national education ministry, with respect to technical issues at the bottom studs, and more specifically at the level of teachers, we see that they do not give independence to teachers. This needs to be balanced and regulated. And like I said, decision-making needs to be free, but of course there are gaps that emerge, and people become hesitant, and teachers can feel bothered by this. But of course, we need to give value and attach value to teachers and students and enable them to develop. And we need a system that encourages this. And our current legal system, we need to focus on not just legal changes, but maybe a change of mindset, because within this hierarchy, especially with the direct implementers of this service, we need to focus on these. Our legal system actually allows for this, and it allows us an area to maneuver. And implementing decisions in cities that have been made in the center is actually an issue of interpretation. So at the very bottom of the chain, it requires the approach of the people at the bottom of the chain. And it's not just with like police officers or soldiers, because they have a very rigid hierarchy, but at the very lower levels, there is an attempt to implement this appropriately. Now, some schools and organizations and autonomy, aside from these, the autonomy of teachers, especially with respect to pedagogy, without disrupting this hierarchy, the teacher actually needs to be valued, and they need to be given an area space to decide. So the teacher needs to develop their own skills and develop and foster the development of students as well. So the teacher, if they cannot improve and develop themselves, then they cannot foster the development of children either. And teachers are very much valued in the Ottoman times at the time and in earlier times, but after the 80s, we saw that there was a decline in the value attached to teachers. However, in the early periods of the Republic, was that the case? No. So we need to put the teachers at the center. We need to have a national plan. And this is the case for all countries. But within the national implementation, it needs to be flexible and needs to give teachers room to breathe, because 30 students enter a classroom, the teacher closes the classroom, and they teach. It is a very private area, and that is where the service is directly provided. And then underneath the ministry, that legal regulation needs to allow that. I, as a legal practitioner, believe that the objective of education is to promote the training of individuals to become individualistic. And of course, economy can be a very attractive topic in this regard. So in order to create technologies, research development, patents, we need to establish these first. And I don't mind too much the reflections of this education on economy, but it will, of course, if this is going to be the reward, then we can perceive this as the economic reward. Can we please wrap up? You have about 30 seconds. And with respect to the COVID pandemic, we had a very centralized approach, but our constitutional system is focused on a breadth of legal administration, and there are provincial directorates as well in areas that have endured the pandemic. Even though the current system allows for this, it was not implemented. When we see the 2023 vision, we see that the government's policy is different and the state's policy is different. I don't think they are unimportant, because that is where the legal reliability comes from. But of course, there are other more long-term components, and there are rewards that will be reaped in a very later time. And that's why countries that are able to implement this educational reform can intertwine their policies, but there needs to be a government and state policy, and there needs to be a connection between them. We need to promote the development of individuals who are individualistic, who can think for themselves. And I think there's a lot of ground to cover, and I think we need to be more excited in this regard. If we're not ambitious, we cannot achieve it. Okay, thank you so much. I think that Zafar also said that society is not asking for this. I will give you the mic once again very shortly. And I think that our participants were able to follow up on what you were saying, but I have a very quick question for you all. Now, we discussed and debated COVID over and over again, and we talked about digitalization making a place for itself in our lives and the independence of individuals. I would like some feedback from you all with respect to the reflexes of society. Does digitalization restrict autonomy? Is there a new kind of legal structure that is emerging out of this? Now, let me rephrase this. We actually conducted a study with respect to this conference, and we saw that students and parents had differences, and due to their, actually they turned out very similar results. And we saw that they were they were not autonomous. So if we could just make a few remarks based on digitalization, that would be great. Now, it's a very urgent issue, actually. We think about communication processes, and they become very widespread, and technological advancements have actually introduced new devices into our lives. And it is a very naive approach. Yes, of course, we have several technological toys. There's all of these colorful visuals. You can pick up your phone and speak to someone on the other side of the world, and you can speak to them live. Now, this is very exciting, and it's understandable that it's exciting, but hence its name, it's all virtual. Now we can all see each other's images and our appearances through this platform, but over the past 1.5 years, I've been very unhappy in classes. Why? Well, because when I'm teaching, I'm usually I can understand from the atmosphere of the classroom whether the topic is challenging, or sometimes I can understand if I need to tell a joke or if I need to open the window or ask them to stand so that I can get them more engaged, or should I add something else in class? Now, all of these reflexes, actually, they're driven by the gaze of students. You can tell by looking at these students, and none of these are possible through the screen. The screen it's cold. It's like the cold hemisphere of the brain. Maybe some of you are familiar with this topic. In the 70s, they spoke of this. They said that there's digital alphabetic forms, and there's a world focused on this cold hemisphere. It talks about the northern hemisphere of the world, and with respect to the human brain, it's talking about the cold lobe of the brain, the world of logic. Yes, of course, everything is logical, everything is measurable. Now we can all convey engineering measurements and calculations, but we cannot convey our emotions, our excitement, our gestures, our mimics. When we approach humans from a holistic approach, we see that the digital atmospheres makes up only half of this. And that's why a digital society is an incomplete society. And we speak to elementary school students as well. We want to save them from these screens because children have forgotten how to ride a bike, and now we have to force them to go out. We have to force them to be outdoors. This is a very sad situation, and we need to focus on this independently. So with respect to society, we're not contributing, and we cannot speak of autonomy either. And we have incomplete people, incomplete individuals, but that hemisphere, that cold hemisphere we speak about actually makes up half of their lives. We can use that to our advantage. Maybe some classes can be made solely through remote learning. We can, for example, reflect a text and we can all work on it collectively, but we cannot provide literature classes online, or German literature classes, Turkish literature classes online. I cannot speak of Turkish literature online because it does not register with the students. Okay, and what about Safar? How does society perceive this? Do you think we're becoming more autonomous? At the beginning of the 90s, there was an article that was written. It was about this classroom and the computers. There was a race between them, and the classroom won. Now we talk about digitalization and increased autonomy. Now students can learn whenever they want. No, we see that this is not actually the case. And we actually saw that sometimes students had to force parents had to force their children to attend classes. And so we did not actually achieve that. At a second dimension, we can say that, let me say that this discussion is going on. It's about big data. It's about algorithms. They're guiding us. And let me just say this. When you wake up in the morning, what do you do? In order to understand this autonomy, when you go to the restroom, what do you do? So can we do this independently of our mobile devices? That's great. But we talked about subjective culture and objective culture, and we talk about how, and then there's also objective culture as well. There's a bunch of products and a bunch of objects, and they are taking over all of our spaces, and I'm a bit pessimistic in this regard. I think we're all a bit pessimistic nowadays. Thank you so much. And Egemen, if you could provide your final remarks. What do you think about digitalization and autonomy? Well, okay, let me just say this. Law is an upper level of society, but unfortunately legal is coming from behind, but of course this is expected. So it's only natural, and we see that there is the law on the protection of personal data, and technological data also needs to focus on the protection of personal data. There are cyber crimes, the protection of independent rights, and of course all of these are done. But when we consider educational autonomy, actually technology is a tool. It's just a tool. It's not the final objective. Are we able to use this effectively, and to what extent? What matters here is that the education regulations need to focus on this as well, and investments need to be made. Teachers need to be well trained, and teaching needs to be an effective profession. Teachers need to be encouraged to develop themselves so that they can foster the development of students. And technology is only a tool. We need to use it appropriately. And we need to consider this. So the human factor needs to be at the center of all of our efforts. Yes, of course, the minister is important, but down the chain, there needs to be, yes, a national curriculum, but we need to attach importance to individuals, to teachers, to students. This is the system we need to establish. If we can use digital effectively, that's great, but it does not give a rise to autonomy. Now I have one more question. We're actually out of time, but we will have a break after this. And our participants are actually intrigued very much by what you've been saying. Now, when the Republic was first established, of course, many of you have referred back to that time. And Oktay has said that confrontal education has made this process even harder, but we speak of centralized exams also. And since the 19th century, there's been an industrial revolution, but also an educational revolution. There's industrialization, modernization, urban life. And it has turned schools into factories. And there are, of course, other various reasons for this. But, you know, it's had reflections. It's in many fields. When we had different terminology for the principles and a different kind of hierarchy as well. And in modern times, we have different terms such as visionariness and other sorts of concepts. Now, what we don't want to discuss the past, we want to focus on our future. And are we heading towards more an autonomous structure, or is this progress taking us more towards self-inspection or self? I just want to ask this all to all of you. Now, actually,
now, one of the conditions to establishing autonomy is to have a diversity of schools and having a planning approach that takes into consideration the unique dispositions and needs and expectations of people. And this has been the case during the early periods of our republic. We used to have a vision for our society. Of course, education was left out of this planning again as well, but in all professions, in all aspects, even in a country that nobody has ever heard of, there is a need to have individuals that have the most basic human capabilities of critical thinking. And now, I mentioned that I had been a teacher, and I used to live in Austria for 25 years, and for 11 of those years, I've been a counselor in schools. So Germany and Austria have a similar approach to education called the gymnasium education that covers the 10 to 15% of students. So they don't teach vocational skills. They don't give them a profession. Perhaps they might teach them medicine, they might teach them law, but other than that, they learn about, they receive their vocational training from vocational training institutions. Universities deal with science. They try to progress science, and they try to teach science, and they don't teach professional skills. So if you're going to reach your export targets, if you're going to reach any of your targets as a country, as a nation, then you need to have people that can add value to what they're doing and what you're doing. So we don't have qualified people. For example, technicians, automobile technicians, or jewelry experts. If you employ, for example, 300 jewelry experts, automobile experts, then you need to employ 3,000 computer scientists. And you need to have 2 foreign languages out of the 4 classical languages. For example, Greek, Latin, and Arabic or Persian. You need to combine them as electives and teach also modern languages, for example, English, French, German, Russian, Chinese. These also have to be mandatory language electives, and people should graduate high school speaking 4 or 5 languages. And those people then need to go into institutions that produce scientific knowledge, and the rest need to learn skills, learn professional skills, learn vocational skills, and that needs to be our system, our way of doing things. Now, my answer is that yes, it is possible, but it's not easy, because it's not an education problem, but it's a public administration problem in Turkey, because if we move to a more decentralized approach in our public administration, and if we receive information from bottom to up, then we can achieve that. But there is a reality that we need to face, and we need to face that reality and intervene. Now, we have this and this problem, and only if we work on these problems, then we can have local autonomy. But it's not easy, and we need to consider that we are the products of a certain cultural background, and the authorities, the people in power, don't want to share their power. And this puts us in a cycle that we can't get out of. Now, there used to be a time when a certain law was passed that the authority was delegated, responsibilities were distributed, and I received a phone call. People were asking to me, distinguished chairman, how do we do that? So they were asking me how to do their job. And I told to them, this was what you wanted. So why are you avoiding risk? Why are you avoiding risk and not making decisions. You can't make your own decisions without taking some degree of risk. So what they believe, what they feel is that if you don't take any decisions, then you can't be responsible for any problems. So you need to develop their decision-making skills. But this is the situation we're in. So I would like to interject and move on to Egemen Hoca. So what you're saying is that we aren't doing anything and things are moving along as they always have. Is that what you're saying? Yes. So the system is working as intended and everybody is happy with it. So I don't think there are any problems per se. So yes, both parties are happy with the system. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Egemen. Now, the increase in population, there is, with an increase in population, will we see more centralization or decentralization? What do you think? Now, the law has certain norms and certain options. Of course, there are a lot of options, but the law is also a tool. So we need to take certain decisions regarding our infrastructure. Are we going to be more centralized, or are we going to attribute more responsibility for the people that work in the lower levels of this hierarchy? But to do all of that, you need to be willing and you need to decide. And the decision-making process is outside the scope of law. So in order for us to make certain decisions, the state has to link and decide on certain policies and needs to take certain steps to train capable individuals. But we see that we are moving very speedily towards a very centralized system. And this has been the case during the COVID-19 pandemic as well. The provincial directorates of national education were not given the necessary authority to make their own decisions. The whole nation either shut down altogether or opened altogether. But we need to make use of our legal means and legal
Çok teşekkür ederim.
capabilities altogether. So, a brief question. This conference, the ISPC, I would like to ask a question on behalf of all principals. Our school principals employ certain personnel, and these personnel, when their pension payments were not made, they collect their own payments using other legal means. So how does this work in a legal framework? The position of the school administration as a legal entity, as an employer, are they liable for such things? So the school is a unit, and the school principal is the person responsible for the school. But there isn't any budget, so we have no budget to make these payments. So this is something that has to do with the balance with the school and the parent-teacher association. Of course, the parents are right in asking for having a certain degree of standard in the services at the school. Of course, I'm not aware of the specific example that you've pointed out. I have only one daughter that is not yet in any formal education. She is in preschool at the moment, so I have limited experience, but this school is a unit led by the school principal. and the schools can employ people, but that's not the way how it should be. Because if you're going to have workers, if you're going to have employees, then the Provincial Directorate of National Education should take the responsibility, or the Ministry of National Education. So in state school, you need to have government workers as employees, but in terms of private law and in terms of private employment, the pension payments of these people are sometimes at danger of not being made. And the people, the principals, also have to perform the task of conducting feasibility studies in terms of whether they will be able to pay these people. Yes, of course, we are working very closely with school administrations. All of our members are school principals, and they have a huge sum of pensions debts. And then they also have to go to court because they are being sued. And although they are not legal entities, they are held accountable for the pensions premiums of their employees. Thank you, everybody. It has been a very enlightening and informative session, and we've handled the topic of autonomy from a variety of perspectives. And now, I believe that we have a very solid footing in terms of the theoretical aspect of autonomy, and I would like to thank everybody for their contributions. Now, we have a 1-hour break, and after our break, we are again awaiting all of our participants to join us in our discussions. We will be able to listen to Duncan Waite in the afternoon, and we have other participants and speakers who will be delivering very interesting and informative presentations. And we will have, again, another workshop in the evening, and we are eagerly waiting for your opinions and your input. And I would like to thank all of our teammates and our participants. And now this session has ended. Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice day. And thank you for the invitation. Thank you.